The Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversation with everyday folks about the mystery of life. This podcast is a complement to the Numinous School, my online intuition development program for people who want their self-awareness to serve a greater good. I'm your host, Carmen Spaniola, and today on the podcast, I'm speaking with Toko-pa Turner. Toko-pa is a mystic who blends Sufism with a Jungian approach to dreamwork. In 2001, she founded her dream school, and she continues to lead online learning and in-person retreats with thousands and thousands of followers around the world. Her recent book, Belonging, is a book about exile and remembering ourselves home. I connected with Toko-pa online. She was at home on Salt Spring Island, BC. So Toko-pa, what identities do you lead with?
I love that question. I don't know that anybody's ever asked me anything like that before. I am working on standing in a new identity these days, which is the identity of author. And I say it like that because it has a funny shape when you say author. and so I can carry it with a little self-important humor, But it's a funny thing, it took so long to write a book. It really was such a massive chunk of my life, and suddenly it's done, and I can't believe I did it. So I'm still sort of stepping into that author. And I also identify as woman. And I identify as dreamer and dream worker. So I help people with their dreams, and I help people understand the language of their dreams. So those are my top, I would say.
That they're already fascinating and the way they must work together in relationship. Now, you have an unusual name, and I wonder how that forms part of your identity. I should say unusual to me. You're the only Toko-pa I've ever heard of or known.
My dream is actually to go to New Zealand one day, which is the country of origin of my and maybe perhaps meet a Maori person who has the same name as me, because I'm the only one I know too. But my parents chose the name Toko-pa from a book of poems from different cultures around the world. It was a book called Technicians of the Sacred by Jerome Rothenberg. And Toko-pa is the name of, for lack of a better word, deities in the Maori creation myth. So Toko-pa actually translates into parent of the mist.
Wow. That's a prophetic name, hey?
You can imagine what it was like to grow up with a name like that. And for a long time, I just dropped the pa because Toko was complicated enough for people.
Right.
But then I learned that papa is actually the language for Mother Earth in the Maori culture. So I realized the pa part was really important. That was the goddess part. That was the mother part, the earth part. So I adopted it back into use probably not until my mid-20s, something like that. But yeah, it's taken some time to grow into it. But now, when I think about it in relation to the work that I do, which is so much about navigating the veil between the worlds, a kind of parent of the mist fits sort of prophetically, as you say.
Absolutely. And already your parents have a bit of a mythology in my mind, sort of developing around them. And I'd love for you to be able to sort of set the record straight for me, because of course it's like, oh, technologists of the sacred. This just sounds like this beautiful, mystical, being enchanted, sort of sung into being. I love it. But I would like for you to be able to describe what it was like for you growing up. What are your parents like, and how did you start on this earth plane?
I appreciate the sensitivity that it it takes to find the story behind the story that immediately gets projected onto things. I don't think enough people do that. But yeah, so I was actually born in England. And when my parents split up, I was just 4 years old. And they split up because my father was actually physically abusive and violent. And so my mother left him. And we moved to Canada, which is the country my grandparents had um, uh, had run away to after being survivors of the Holocaust in Poland. So we moved back to Canada, where my grandparents were. And my mother became involved with another partner who was a leader in the international Sufi order. And so, for those of your listeners who don't know about Sufism, it's a mystical branch of Islam, an ancient form of mysticism, which you would probably recognize through the poetry of Rumi. A lot of people know who Rumi is. So, Rumi was sort of the original Sufi. And there are movements of people who have broken off from the more traditional Islamic traditions and who have become interested in the more mystical side of that world. And so that's the Sufis. And so I was raised in a commune in the red light district of Montreal. And so we were very poor, but we had a big tenement that I suppose we must have rented, and it had, like, I can't even believe this, but I think it had 18 rooms in the house, and there were all these transient hippies that were living there or just passing through. And so we would eat communal meals together, and it was all vegetarian. And every day we would come together for prayer, and especially song, or what the Sufis call zikir, which is the chanting of the different names of God in a state of ecstasy.
Mm.
And my mother was a yoga teacher, so we practiced yoga. So that was a little bit my life when I was growing up. And yet, of course, I'll just add that, like any spiritual community, it also casts a profound shadow. So there was a lot of difficulty in my childhood home.
Can you, I want to ask about that, but can you clarify for me, was this a multicultural context, or, you're in Montreal, which is a relatively cosmopolitan city, for Canada, but like, can you be a Sufi and not be Muslim, or did you convert at some point? Can you just clarify the technicality of that there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the leaders so there are different orders. There are different Sufi orders, and the International Sufi Order was started by an Indian mystic I should say, an Oxford-educated Indian mystic named Hazrat Inayat Khan. And then he had a son whose name was Pir Vilayat Inayat Khan, and he succeeded his father, and so to become the leader of the International Sufi Order. And so when I was a kid, Pir Vilayat was the leader of the Sufi Order. And so at this point, there is nothing to do really with being Muslim. Sufi is a completely different thing. From the fact that they have their roots in Islam is actually controversial. There are some people who say that Sufism is even older than than Islam. So yes, it was an international order, which means that people of all different races and cultures joined, although there were a lot of hippies,
Okay.
Yeah, but I would say from a cultural perspective, there was a mix of Hinduism and Sanskrit and even some Buddhism thrown in there. So it was a bit of a mashup.
Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, I could imagine, moving forward a bit to being preteen, let's say, just before your adolescence, there must have been, some excitement, or at least a lot of novelty, with lots of people coming and going. But as you say, there's this shadow side. And I do wonder how maybe the legacies or impacts of your absent father, or the abuse that your mother had suffered, or kind of living in this communal way in a within a larger context that isn't terribly collectivist. I imagine there were a lot of confusing messages at that time. And I understand through your book that you left home, or you ran away, or there were many problems. Can you tell me about that time, maybe from about 10 years old, and what it was like, you think, that precipitated your leaving the commune?
Mm. I have to say that I think the precipitating event was actually the move that we made to live in the white suburbs, because I had been living in the urban center my whole life, downtown Montreal. And then my grandmother decided that the way that her daughter, my mother, was living was kind of shameful, and that she should have a house and they should have a nuclear family and all of that. So she bought my mother and her husband, my stepfather, a house in the suburbs. And everything overnight changed, because suddenly we weren't in a multicultural context. Suddenly we were living in a very rich, very white suburban neighborhood. And I was suddenly going, instead of going to art school, which is what I had been doing in the city, going to some funky art school with lots of different ages. And suddenly I was with all of these, all of these very privileged white kids. And I had grown up, I was telling you what our tenement was like. I mean, we had, rats living in the floors, and there were winters in Montreal where we didn't have heat on in the house. I mean, we were scraping by. But suddenly all of the people I went to class with were people who lived in these huge mansions, and when they turned 16, their parents gave them cars. And so everything really shifted at that point. It was, I think it was really hard on all of us. And suddenly my family became this very small bubble of just my mother, my stepfather, and my siblings. And I think this was when I discovered that my mother really had, how to put this, had really been struggling, was really struggling emotionally and mentally. Maybe something that wasn't as obvious when I was younger, and wasn't as obvious in that more varied context of living in the commune with all of those different influences in my midst. And so it felt like becoming quite intimate with her difficulty
Mm.
at that age too. And of course, I don't know really from her perspective what it was like to make that sudden shift as well.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
suddenly we were very isolated all of a sudden.
So how did you end up in the foster care system?
Mhm. Well, I started running away around that age, around 9 or 10, and I wasn't very good at it when I was young because I had no survival skills at all. But I had so much conflict at home, and I felt so unhappy that I started to have self-destructive thoughts, and they became pervasive. I had a very difficult time in school. I was bullied relentlessly. I was obviously this very weird kid who came from this very weird background, and felt very much like an outsider there. And then when I came home, there was so much chaos and rage and violence that there was no um, respite on either end. And so I started running away to something, I don't know what. I think at that age, partying felt like a place where I could just be free somehow with friends.
Like when
And
you were like 10?
not quite, no, it would have
Okay.
been a little bit older. I think I skipped ahead a little bit, probably around 14. I
Okay.
started hanging out with kids who were older than me, and
Mm.
um, hanging out with boys, and And then finally, I think when I was just turning 15, I ran away for good.
Mm.
And the cops came and found me. I was staying at my older boyfriend's house at the time. And they picked me up and they wanted to take me home. And they asked me, "Do you want to go home?" And I'll never forget, it was a fateful moment because my answer was no. I don't want to go back to that place. And that was when they took me instead to a detention center, a youth detention center downtown. And that was the beginning of my being placed into the foster system.
As an adult now, and knowing what you know from your own healing journey and, the current research and more trauma-informed mental health practice, etc., how do you feel about the systems that we have as a culture for youth? How did you even get out? I imagine it's by the grace of being a beautiful white girl that you managed to get out, as well as probably many other things. But so many children, I'm thinking of Indigenous children, how do you reconcile all of this now, since you've been on the other side as a child, knowing what it's like to say, I don't want to go home, and then you're taken to a place called a detention center?
Mhm. Right. Well, of course, many of the reasons why I've been able to survive that life definitely have to do with my privileges, like being white and being um, intelligent and being, as you say, attractive. And also, I wouldn't paint that period of my life as anything other than horrible.
Hmm.
There were many, many years in which I suffered like many of the young people who are in the system do, who don't have parents and who turn to the wrong coping mechanisms.
Hmm.
So I just want to acknowledge that, it wasn't like I slid out of the system into some perfect life.
Hmm.
And so there were many privileges I didn't have. For instance, an education,
Mm.
and had to struggle really for everything that I received.
Mhm.
Maybe not everything, but and so, man, that's a big question. How do I feel about the system? I mean, the system is just that. It's a system. It is a machine, and it does nothing to help anyone, really.
Mhm.
It's just, I guess, a system of triage, right? Like
Mhm.
what to do with people who have nowhere to go. But there's a huge amount of corruption within the system, including sexual abuse and physical abuse and neglect. And I came face to face with all of these things myself. Um, and yet, um, I needed somewhere to go.
Mm.
And yeah, I mean, and then here in British Columbia, where we live, Carmen, I have been doing research about the system here, and I've learned that 80% of the kids who are in the system here are Indigenous youth.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
it's really another residential school system, isn't it? Except now we don't keep them in one centralized place, but it's still a horrifying colonialist legacy where we'll take people out of the home, but we don't actually put them anywhere other than some kind of other prison. It's just so horrible.
it's so staggering. And then, of course, the way that my mind works is I go to ask the questions of why? Why, are all of these kids being put into the system? And then you get into all these complex systemic racism issues, which are so deep and so fresh. And yeah.
Do you
So
think we can do better? Like, given that we live in a capitalist society and a patriarchal society and a white dominant society, do you think we actually can do any better? Or do you sort of put your uh, effort into something at a smaller communal level? I'm just curious.
Well, absolutely. I think we can do better, no question, you know? And I think we are doing better, lots of us. I think there are lots of people who are working at different forms of activism to make change. You know, I met this beautiful elder just last week in Victoria who told me his story, and he was telling me the story of how his mother had been put into residential schools, and so he was the direct descendant of that experience, and sort of telling me the ways in which it has shaped and thwarted his own life and his tribal life as well. But when I said something similar, like, you know, we have this appalling resistance to looking at the underlying issues and taking responsibility, he actually corrected me and said, there's lots of people out there who are taking responsibility. And it kind of shocked me
Mm.
because I thought, well, that's a very generous perspective, you know, to look at the ways in which things are changing. And I personally know a lot of people who are working their fingers to the bone or their hearts to the bone, or however you want to put it, to make changes. And so there's lots of different forms of activism, and I think we have to be really careful not to judge what is effective and what is not effective. Some people are working at the level of consciousness itself. Other people are working at the front lines, you know, helping young people find opportunities or reclaim their language, or you know, reintroduce pride. And so there's a lot. It's a big, big topic.
I'm curious how Dreamwork helped pull you and your life into a different direction.
Mm, thank you. Yes. I mean, I really think of dreams as nature itself, naturing through us. And so I don't mean this as a metaphor. I mean literally the land, in the same way that the earth pushes nutrients up through a plant, and then that plant then expresses itself in flowers which emit honey, you know,
Mhm.
or whatever it is, that something similar happens with us. Why wouldn't it? We're part of our ecosystems. And so dreams, for me, what I have experienced is really having been parented by my dreams, because I didn't, in the absence of the guidance that I should have had from the outside world, I turned instead to these dreams. And they produced so much guidance for me over the years, and they continue to do that. And so I believe that when we turn towards our dreams, we are actually listening to the larger inclination of the land,
Mm.
in which the land of our origin, and that there is an intelligence there which is wanting to move our lives in a direction of not only alignment for the personal purpose, which is where a lot of people will stop and focus, but how that personal purpose then is embedded in the larger ecosystem, or the larger need, or the larger culture, but then not just the human culture, the other than human culture, which is the entirety of our working together.
Wow. So let's just slow down because I think a lot of people, I mean, it's such a beautiful notion it's almost an animist perspective, right? To say the earth is dreaming through me, and I am able to give voice or interpretation, but it isn't about me. It's about me being in this larger relationship. Have I got you?
Yeah, 100%. Beautifully put.
So, I would like to bring in a particularly interesting dream that you wrote about in your book, Belonging, Remembering Ourselves Home. And there in chapter 3, which is called The Death Mother, you actually have a dream, which I'd like to read now. Do you mind if I do that?
Please go ahead.
Okay, it's called The Witch's Grave, Toko-pa's Dream. I dreamed some of the male analysts from the Young Foundation were deep in a forest, building a platform out of wood. What they didn't realize is that they were building it on the grave of a powerful witch who was awakening in a rage. In what felt like an instant, she leapt from her grave and unleashed her fury, slaughtering the men and everyone else in sight. It was a terrifying bloodbath. Now, I'm interested in this dream because I'm very interested in rage and survival rage as being one of these very important responses. It's not even an emotion, it's a reaction that comes from the body to say, I'm going to protect life and limb and loved ones. And it's so important for us in terms of being able to make change, not just personally, but I think socially. Now, I have lots of clients who come in my program. You have a course, a Dreamwork course that runs several times a year, and people can really dive right into that specifically. In my course in the Numinous School, we just have 1 month where we look at working with dreams and the moon. And of course, people want to bring their scary dreams, right? Dreams a bit like this. They're murderous, or they're dismemberment dreams, or there's, rage dreams, and they might call them nightmares or dark dreams, etc. Now, this dream, I love because my perception, I would love to unpack that in, 10 different ways. But can you talk about how you would approach working with that kind of dream? What do you do with that dream after you have it? When you say turn towards, what are you actually doing?
Yeah, so there's a danger when we talk about turning towards a difficult dream where somebody might begin to think that they have to override their instinct, which is to be frightened by and shaken by and want to deny that dream. And so I'm not talking about override or bypass here.
Mm.
Turning towards is a little bit like later down the line, And this is the place we want to get to eventually. And I hear you say, I love this dream. But Carmen, if you woke up with this dream, you would not love it.
Right. I'd be shaky.
Yeah, you'd be shaky, you'd be terrified, you'd be, it might take days for you to recover, which is what happened to me when I had this dream. Of course, we can love it now because I've integrated it. And by integrating it, now I can write about it in such a way that empowers the images of this dream. So it's important to just notice that process has already happened behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, when we receive a dark or difficult dream, the reason why it is, I think of it a little bit like it has turned up the volume on something we haven't paid attention to before. We might have gotten many hints before in other form, and we're not listening, we're ignoring, we're turning away from it. And so it gets louder and louder and louder until it's screaming at us because it needs our attention. So just to give people a little bit of context, I had this dream after years of studying at the Jung Foundation of Ontario. And I had been deeply interested in Jungian analytical psychology for a long time. I had devoted myself to it in a way. I was a devotee. But I, for a long time, was feeling like there was a limitation to that way of approaching dreams. And it was like there was something more important that wasn't being accessed. There was a power in me which was being denied. There was there was something feminine upon which a platform was being built that I needed to tear down in my own psyche. And so in as much as I love the Jungians and I have learned so much about working with dreams from that world, from that school of thought, there it is still a patriarchal structure, which, by the way, you need hundreds of thousands of dollars and a master's degree to study to even gain entry into that world. So you can imagine what Jungian gatherings look like.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. They're moneyed. They're pretty, I imagine they're pretty homogenous.
They are. In fact, I really only know of, a handful, if that, of people of color who have completed the whole training program in the world.
Yeah, maybe I'm trying to think, like maybe Jean Shinoda Bolin. I'm trying to think. I don't know if she's completed all of, but she's gone
Yeah,
to.
yeah, she is a Jungian,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, but yeah, finding.
Well, she's just one of the famous ones,
That's
like.
right. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So
So,
anyway, so just
yeah.
so just coming back for a moment to the dream. So what was being shown to me here was I had this growing discomfort that I was ignoring. And so the dream had to just show me that there was this witch, this ancient feminine thing that was underneath, living in the earth, under and presumed dead. And instead, this other thing was building a platform on her grave, which is exactly what analytical psychology is. It's saying you need a middleman with a degree to tell you what your dreams mean.
Mm-hmm.
But there was something deeper, something more feminine, something more ancient, which was growing in rage that needed to tear all of that down in my life. And so this dream was really the beginning for me of becoming much more interested in indigenous dreaming practices, but even more importantly than that, in just having a direct relationship with my own dreams, with my own inner teachers.
Mm-hmm. It's a fabulous dream. Can you define what you mean by feminine?
In this context,
Yes.
well, the Jungians use the language, the feminine, to speak about a vast umbrella under which many things fall. And under that umbrella could be anything from the instinctual life, the feelings, the sensitivity itself, um, connectedness, and the ability to be relational, interdependent, what some people call Gaia philosophy. Um, and then, of course, all of the iterations of having a relationship with the unseen world. So mysticism, everything from midwifery to herbology to witchcraft to, you can basically think of anything that's been uh, maligned by the dominant culture, and you could say it probably falls under the purview of what the Jungians call the feminine.
Right.
And of course, it's difficult to use that language because the language is charged, and we have gendered associations to that language. But I kind of don't have that anymore because I've broken that down for myself. But sometimes what I use alternatively is the language around yin and yang, which is the Chinese model of the interdependent halves of one whole.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate the specificity, though, of being able to describe, because the Jungians, well, as we've said, they're quite homogenous. And so when they say feminine, it's very difficult to not think about gender breakdowns, because that is the context in which this thought is emerging. Even though I love Jung, everybody, I know the Jungians are getting up in arms right now, but I also, when they say feminine, I in my mind automatically substitute connective. When they say masculine, I automatically substitute independent, that sort of thing. And so I have to just like unhook and kind of put it in like historical context. I love Jung, and especially in his later more mystical years and writing, especially, and when it writes about synchronicities and things like that, of course. But if, he's a product of his time and his culture, he couldn't really see his own whiteness or the page, Anyway, I don't want to hijack the conversation, but I really appreciate you taking the time to flesh out what feminine means to you and how you're using the term. I think that's really,
Absolutely.
it adds much more texture too to the dream, I think.
Yeah, I've actually devoted a whole chapter in my book called The Inner Marriage, devoted to trying to break down this language around feminine and masculine. And I actually replace it with eros and logos,
Mhm.
uh, which also has its own challenges. But
Yeah.
but just an attempt to just try on different language so we can understand the things, like you said, outside of the context of those old patriarchal structures. And of course, that was one of the huge problems that I had with the Jungian world, was this whole concept that Jung had around the anima and animus. And it's this
Mhm.
basic idea that if you're born into a female body, that your undeveloped side is the animus or the
Mhm.
masculine. I just had way too many people in my life, including myself, who consider themselves much more fluid on the gender spectrum. That was not true. And
Mhm.
so I rejected that whole idea pretty early on, but it's it's very classical Jungian.
Mhm. Mhm. Now, we started the interview with you identifying as author, and this is your first book, Belonging, Remembering Ourselves Home. And I'm curious, and I ask this with loving curiosity, not as a challenge, but what made you feel that you had the knowledge or the ability now to write about the topic of belonging?
Hmm. Well, to be honest, I have never thought or felt that. It's quite the opposite. I don't consider myself an expert in belonging. I consider myself an expert in not belonging. Because, at this very early age, I didn't feel like I belonged in my own home, and that persisted throughout my whole life, not being an orphan, even though I had parents who are alive in the world, and taking a very countercultural path. And so it wasn't ever a decision to write a book, actually. It was more as if I was possessed by the question of what is this thing that haunts my foundations?
Mm.
How can I understand the dimensions of the exile that I feel in my own life better? And do other people have that same experience? And so so there was something that happened, or a series of things that happened to me, including being struck with a debilitating illness, which forced me even deeper into confrontation of those questions. And so I did what always I have done, which is to just write about it. And so I started to write, and the writing led me to receive more dreams.
Mm.
And the dreams seemed to be teaching me about different ways of looking at belonging that I had never considered before. And so I would write what I understood to be the teachings of those dreams. And before you knew it, it wasn't journaling anymore. I realized it was a book.
Mm.
And so I committed at some later date to turning it into a book, which was complicated because now I had this like patchwork of random ideas, which had to be, smoothed into some kind of narrative order. So hopefully I've succeeded in making some kind of sense of all of that.
It's quite lovely, and I very much feel that there is an we could say an archetypal quality to it, because you are seeking a pathway home, right? It's like you're in the forest, and you are it feels as the reader that we're following you along this journey, and it brings in a lot of themes about ancestral longing and things that I think are very relevant. Certainly, they've been coming up in my life and the life of a lot of my clients as well. And you mentioned that one of the pathways, or the crucible, one of them, to understanding belonging was the experience of a persistent and debilitating illness. And I imagine all the emotions come with that. But I'm curious how you now, at this time in your life, Toko-pa, how do you manage and express and cope with grief?
Mm. Well, what else can you do but grieve it? There were a lot of years when I lived in the system, which was a very dangerous place. And after that, because I was still so young and vulnerable, even leaving the system many years, in which I never grieved because you couldn't show your weakness, you couldn't show your vulnerability, because if you did, you would get um, targeted.
Hmm.
And so I very successfully managed to seal that place off and go into a kind of survival mode for years and years and years. And at some point, I think it was after I fell in love for the first time in my life, my first love. I was in my early 20s and I met a fellow, and we were together for a number of years. And I would wake up every night having had these terrible dreams in tears. So there was all this like unprocessed grief, which was just coming to the surface despite my efforts to keep it down. And that was really the beginning of healing those pipes, healing those dry taps. And my God, there was a lot of it. I'm talking decades now of ungrieved grief. And so now my relationship with grief is really to affirm it when it arises. So I cry a lot. I cry every day. Sometimes I cry from beauty. Sometimes it's just a few, wet tears in the corner of my eyes. Um, Sometimes it's through my compassion for others who are suffering, and sometimes it's through my own suffering. But there's a lot of it, and I really, I don't. It's hard to grieve unless you have some kind of support system to help you do
Mhm.
that. And so a lot of people, say in my situation, very similarly, don't have the time and space and safety to grieve. And so you just kind of have to keep, pulling your boots on, that kind of thing. But I'm very blessed to finally be in a place in my life where I have a lovely partner and, I can pay my bills and these kinds of things. And so, um, yeah, it gives me the privilege and space and time in order to grieve my grief. But I think whatever our circumstances are, we have to find a way to allow our grief to express itself, right?
And I
But I
think,
think,
go ahead.
sorry, I was just going to finish that thought by saying that one of the biggest obstacles to doing that is not necessarily our circumstances, but is our own internal relationship to the affirming of that grief as a healthy and necessary part of the spectrum of being, right? Because there's so much invalidation that we have around being weak or falling apart or looking ugly or whatever your thing is, that may make us believe that we should distance ourselves from our grief, that it will be bottomless, that it will be endless. And yet we have to find a way to do it anyway, because really that moisture that comes out is what fertilizes the soil around us so that new life can grow there.
And your book, Belonging, is really a process of unraveling all of the unworthiness and the loneliness and the othering that has invalidated those emotions. So I want to thank you for the uh, depth of vulnerability and the incredible um, care that you've taken towards the reader and in sharing this book. And thank you so much for being on the show today. I have so many other questions about Dreamwork, but I think I'll just put in the notes a link to your course, because I know that people have questions about what if you don't dream, what if you, all of that. So everything will be in the show notes. But thank you so much for being on the show today, Toko-pa.
Oh, well, thank you for the incisiveness of your questions, Carmen. I really appreciate meeting you in this place. And if you'd ever like to do it again, we can always have a part 2.
That sounds great. Thank you. Isn't she fascinating? And so gently poetic, isn't she, about such painful and complex topics? You can find out all about Toko-pa's fascinating dream school and where to buy her book on her website, Toko-pa.com, Toko-pa.com. As always, I like to thank the listeners around the world who are taking their time with me today. So I would like to thank all my listeners living in the province of Quebec. Je t'aime, Québec. J'ai d'abord visité votre belle province en 1987, je crois, lors d'un échange en immersion française. Je suis revenue plusieurs fois, et si je devais choisir une autre province au Canada pour vivre, je pense que ce serait la vôtre. Merci d'être resté avec nous ici en Canada. J'espère que vous ne partez jamais, mais bien sûr, je respecte totalement votre droit de le faire si vous le souhaitez. Okay, let's talk about Quest. We need to set a date, a deadline, okay? So let's say April 1st. That is the day deposits are due to retreat with me during the full moon in June 2018. Who is coming with? Me and Ruben and a beautiful group, so far comprised just of women this year. You can now place your deposit online and learn all the details on my website under the Retreats tab. Just go to carmenspagnola.com, CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.